The palace fire was no accident. As London's fog hung heavy, flames erupted from Buckingham's East Wing, an area sealed since Queen Elizabeth's reign. Officials called it faulty wiring, but whispers from the servants' quarters told a darker story. That fire didn't just destroy paper and stone, it erased a will. A secret will that Queen Elizabeth had hidden, with words meant to shape the monarchy's future and to destroy Camilla forever. In the days that followed, official reports were circulated swiftly. They spoke of aging pipes, of fragile wiring running behind the walls, of sparks that supposedly caught in the middle of renovation work. A controlled narrative was rolled out across newspapers and television screens. The palace was old, the fire was predictable, and there was no cause for alarm. Yet, within the marble corridors and echoing kitchens, the whispers told a very different story. Servants who had lived through decades of palace silence carried their own suspicions. They had seen shadows that night, shapes gliding where no one should have been, movements too deliberate to be explained away by an electrical fault. The East Wing had long been a mystery. Locked and forgotten, its doors rarely opened even under Queen Elizabeth's watch. It was said to hold little more than dusty archives, records too old to matter. Yet why then, the staff asked, had the fire consumed only documents and parchments, leaving surrounding stone and corridors untouched? Why did nothing of real value vanish? Only the words, only the records. That question hung in the air heavier than smoke, because the fire seemed almost purposeful, almost designed to silence something that could never be spoken aloud. Charles sat with these thoughts pressing against him like a suffocating weight. At 76, his reign was already fragile, his health a constant concern, his heart pulled between duty and private pain. And now, after his mother's passing, he faced the ghost of her secrets. He had always believed he knew every hidden passage of Buckingham, every archive carefully guarded under her command. But this blaze revealed something else. There were parts of her legacy he was never meant to see. And perhaps that was what frightened him most, that she had hidden truths even from him, her eldest son, her heir, her king. In the private chambers, the servants' hushed voices grew bolder. A butler claimed he had glimpsed a woman's figure moving quickly into the East Wing on the night of the fire. A maid insisted she saw two shadows where none should have been, the taller figure guiding the smaller. Their faces were hidden, but the whispers of familiarity ran deep. These were not intruders breaking in from the outside. They were insiders, people who belonged to the royal household itself. The thought chilled Charles, because it meant that betrayal did not stand outside the palace gates. It walked beside him, under his very roof. The East Wing, once sealed off as a relic, had suddenly become the epicenter of mystery. And with every passing day, Charles felt the weight of unfinished conversations with his late mother. He remembered the firmness in her eyes, the way she sometimes paused when Camilla's name was spoken, as though carrying a judgment she never fully shared. Could the fire have destroyed more than documents? Could it have taken away her final words, words that might have warned him of exactly what he faced now? He carried the unease silently, but it pressed harder with each hour. His marriage, once seen as a sanctuary against the storms of public scrutiny, now felt like a cage filled with smoke. Love had carried him through years of scandal, but trust had begun to fracture. The fire's secrets threatened not only the monarchy, but also the bond he had fought so long to defend. And as the embers cooled, Charles sensed that the blaze had only been the beginning. But who would dare erase the Queen's own words, and why now, in Charles's fragile reign? The answer lay not in Parliament or press, but within his very home, with Camilla and her daughter plotting in silence. Before the fire consumed it, the secret had already been discovered. In a dust-choked wall niche hidden behind faded wallpaper, a construction worker stumbled upon the unthinkable Queen Elizabeth's handwritten will. A will that named not Camilla, but William and Catherine as the monarchy's future safeguard. Worse still, it carried a warning: Camilla must never sit on the throne. One discovery, one secret letter, became the fuse for the fire that followed. The man who found it had no idea what he was holding at first. A routine day, another shift in the half-forgotten East Wing, and then his knife blade slipped against the wall, peeling back a piece of faded paper to reveal a small cavity. Inside was a sealed envelope heavy with age, stamped with the royal crest. Curiosity overpowered caution. By the dim light of his torch, he broke the wax, expecting perhaps inventory lists or forgotten correspondence. Instead, his breath caught in his throat, as the elegant, sharp strokes of Queen Elizabeth's handwriting spread before his eyes. This wasn't a trivial note. It was her will, her final instructions hidden away in secrecy. His hands shook as he read. The words were deliberate, even as the ink trembled faintly from age. Entire estates, Sandringham farms, hidden accounts, private funds were marked for William and Catherine, ensuring their independence and power. The Queen had made certain the next generation would stand strong, untouched by rivalries or outside influence. But beneath these bequests lay a clause so damning it froze him where he stood. In unflinching words, Elizabeth declared Camilla unfit for the throne, commanding that she must never hold power over the monarchy. It was more than inheritance. It was a warning, a curse, and a final judgment from the woman who had kept the crown steady for 70 years. The worker's awe quickly curdled into fear. He knew the value of what he held. This was no mere document, it was a weapon, and in the right hands, it could unseat a queen. That was when Laura Lopes appeared in the picture. Camilla's daughter, known publicly as a refined art curator, privately as fiercely protective of her mother's standing, had already heard whispers from within the renovation crew. She moved quickly, arranging a meeting in secrecy. In a quiet cafe tucked into Kensington's narrow streets, she sat across from him, her voice low but commanding. The envelope slid across the table, its contents heavy with destiny, and in return, she slid him an envelope of her own, thousands of pounds in crisp notes. The worker hesitated only for a heartbeat before greed overrode hesitation. The will was hers. When Laura read it, her blood ran cold. Every line felt like a dagger aimed at her mother. Elizabeth had not only safeguarded William and Catherine, but deliberately carved Camilla out of the monarchy's future. It was a rejection that stretched beyond the grave, one that mocked every sacrifice, every step her mother had taken to transform scandal into legitimacy. Rage boiled inside her, yet so did terror. If the letter ever surfaced, it would be the end not just of Camilla's queenship, but of the life Laura herself had built in the shadows of royalty. Still, Laura was no stranger to strategy. She understood immediately that this letter was more than an insult. It was leverage. In her hands, it could become a shield, a bargaining chip, a tool to bend events in their favor. But as the night wore on and she stared again and again at her grandmother's unmistakable hand, the truth sank in. The will was a curse waiting to be unleashed, a curse that could burn down everything her mother had fought for. But Laura didn't keep it. She delivered it to her mother, and in that moment, mother and daughter sealed their place in the monarchy's darkest scandal. When Camilla first read the will, her tears weren't of grief, but of betrayal. After decades fighting for acceptance, Queen Elizabeth's final words cut her down as an imposter. Yet beside her sat Laura, calm, calculating, determined. To Camilla, it was heartbreak. To Laura, it was strategy. That night, a mother wept, while a daughter whispered the words that would ignite a crime. "We must make it disappear." Camilla's hands trembled as she held the paper, her eyes moving across each word as though they were barbs piercing her flesh. Every sentence echoed a lifetime of humiliation, the years of being called the outsider, the destroyer of Diana's marriage, the woman unworthy of wearing the crown. She had clawed her way through decades of scandal, standing firm against the world's disdain, and yet Elizabeth's final message reduced it all to ash. The late Queen's judgment was merciless, branding her not as a queen, not even as a wife, but as a threat to the very monarchy she now served. The weight of history pressed hard on her chest. Diana's presence lingered like a ghost, haunting every corridor of the palace. Camilla had lived in the shadow of Diana's memory for decades. Endless comparisons, whispered condemnations, and the cold stares of those who believed she had stolen a crown that was never hers to wear. Now they will confirm it. Elizabeth had seen her in the same light as Diana's loyal supporters did. A usurper, never fit to sit beside a king. Camilla's tears flowed not only for the insult, but for the life she had fought for, and the fragile love she had defended against public judgment. But where Camilla saw despair, Laura saw opportunity. Her daughter's gaze was steady, her mind already calculating. To Laura, this was not about heartbreak. It was about survival. She knew what the letter meant, if revealed. Camilla's reign would collapse in disgrace, and Laura herself would be dragged down with her. In that chilling realization, Laura's voice carried none of her mother's sorrow, only ruthless pragmatism. "We cannot let this exist," she told her firmly. "If the Queen wishes to bury it, we must bury it deeper. If it is seen, it will destroy us both." Camilla looked up, her heart breaking further at her daughter's coldness. A part of her wanted to cling to the hope that the document could be hidden, locked away, perhaps forgotten with time. But Laura dismissed such weakness with a shake of her head. Hiding it meant it could still be found. Destroying it was the only way to erase its power forever. The very thought of it made Camilla recoil. Setting fire to her late mother-in-law's words felt like sacrilege, an act that crossed every line of honor. Yet Laura's calm logic pressed in like a vice. If you hesitate, it will be William who holds this letter next, and he will use it against you. Do you want that, Mother? Do you want him to watch you fall? Her heart warred with her conscience, but Camilla's tears were no match for Laura's icy resolve. Slowly, painfully, she realized her daughter was right. Survival demanded sacrifice. The will was not simply words on paper, it was a dagger held to her throat. And so, with a trembling nod, she agreed. It was the moment her fate was sealed, the moment she crossed from desperation into destruction. And so, the two women slipped into shadows with fire as their chosen weapon, never realizing the flames would consume their own lives more than the Queen's letter. Rain fell outside, while smoke rose inside Buckingham. Cloaked figures crept through corridors, gasoline cans in hand, their faces hidden, their hearts pounding. When the match struck, flames leapt high, devouring velvet and parchment. In the ashes, the Queen's words turned to smoke. To the world, it was an accident of wiring, but in truth, it was a daughter shielding her mother, and a queen burning her last chance at redemption. The palace was silent when they entered, save for the distant hum of machinery left behind by renovation crews. Shadows swallowed them whole, but their steps were steady, purposeful, rehearsed in whispers days before. The air carried the smell of dust and paint, but beneath it was the heaviness of fear. Camilla's hand trembled as she clutched the canister, her chest tight with dread. She had been groomed to smile before cameras, to bear herself as a sovereign. But here she was, a queen reduced to an intruder in her own palace, about to destroy the very words that could strip her title forever. Beside her, Laura was unshaken. Her voice was low, sharp, commanding. Every movement was deliberate as she urged her mother on. Where Camilla faltered, Laura pressed forward. She reassured her with ruthless calm, reminding her that hesitation meant ruin, that discovery meant exile, that the monarchy would cast them out like outlaws. Laura's grip on her mother's arm was more than physical. It was the anchor that pulled Camilla past fear and into action. When the first splash of gasoline hit the wooden chests and the parchment boxes, the reality became undeniable. Camilla's tears blurred her vision as she poured, the liquid soaking through her past and her future in equal measure. She remembered the Queen's cold eyes, Diana's lingering ghost, the years of climbing uphill only to be branded unworthy in ink. Her hand shook so violently that Laura had to steady the can for her. But when the match was struck, it was Camilla who let it fall. The flame hissed, then roared to life, clawing through fabric and paper with merciless hunger. The fire spread with unnatural speed, the sealed room suffocating under its own smoke. Flames licked through stacks of documents, curling parchment into ash, erasing royal decrees, records, and most importantly, the will itself. Camilla coughed as black smoke stung her lungs, panic rising as the blaze grew uncontrollable. Laura pulled her toward the door, her resolve never wavering even as her mother staggered. Together they fled the inferno, their cloaks clinging to damp skin as they burst back into the night. Rain poured over them, masking their sweat and tears, washing soot from their faces as they stumbled toward their escape. For a fleeting moment, relief replaced terror. In the storm's cover, Camilla whispered gratitude, clinging to her daughter with trembling arms. Yet, as the flames behind them consumed the Queen's final words, a seed of regret lodged itself in her chest. She knew she had burned more than paper. She had burned trust, burned legacy, burned the very remnants of decency that once tethered her to her husband and to the crown. The night's rain could not wash away that truth, but fire leaves more than ashes. It leaves suspicion. And as Charles studied the aftermath, the smoke carried whispers that pointed directly to his wife. Charles had heard whispers before, but now he had proof. Hidden within the palace was his mother's old surveillance system, unknown even to Camilla. When he replayed the grainy footage, the screen showed two figures cloaked in shadow. One tall, moving with Camilla's unmistakable grace. The other, younger, sharper, Laura. The king's heart broke as his worst suspicion became the truth. His wife and her daughter had burned the Queen's final will. The discovery came late at night, when silence hung over Clarence's house like a heavy curtain. Alone in his study, Charles unearthed the outdated network his mother had once confided to him about. Elizabeth had always believed that threats to the monarchy were not only foreign or political, they sometimes came from within. That secret system, unseen and unspoken of for decades, now revealed what official reports had carefully buried. As the video flickered to life, Charles's chest tightened. At first, the shapes were indistinct, blurred by shadows and static. But then the taller figure shifted, and the familiar curve of her shoulders, the tilt of her head, betrayed everything. It was Camilla, and at her side, the younger woman, quick, determined, was unmistakably Laura. His blood turned cold. For years, he had believed his love for Camilla had been his salvation, the one constant through storms of scandal, media trials, and the endless comparisons to Diana. Now he saw that same woman reduced to a silhouette of betrayal, torch in hand, erasing the words of the mother who had once carried him through his loneliest hours. The weight of it pressed into his chest until he could hardly breathe. He remembered Elizabeth's stern glances whenever Camilla's name was spoken, the unspoken warnings she had buried beneath her reserved exterior. Had she known? Had she foreseen this moment? And was that why she hid her will behind walls no one was meant to find? Tears burned his eyes as anger battled grief. Every memory of stolen laughter with Camilla, every private moment of tenderness, now felt poisoned. He thought of Diana, the woman who had died under the shadow of his choices, and how Camilla had risen from that scandal to finally stand beside him as queen. Had it all been built on lies? Was her devotion nothing more than calculation masked as affection? The questions spiraled, each one cutting deeper. For the first time since his coronation, Charles felt utterly alone, not just as a man, but as a king abandoned by the one he had trusted most. Yet within the wreckage of his heart, resolve began to form. He knew he could no longer cling to sentiment. A monarch could grieve in private, but he could not falter in duty. The monarchy had survived wars, abdications, and betrayals. It could not now be left at the mercy of flames lit by his own wife. The footage was more than evidence, it was a weapon, undeniable and irrefutable. He would no longer allow whispers to dictate his actions. He would confront her, not as a husband pleading for truth, but as a king holding judgment. But Camilla was no fool. She sensed her husband's cold eyes, and before he could act, she struck first with lies, scandals, and allies in the shadows. A cornered queen becomes the most dangerous enemy. Camilla gathered lords, editors, and nobles, offering wealth and titles in exchange for one thing: loyalty against Charles. Within days, newspapers screamed of fabricated scandals, painting the king as unfaithful and corrupt. Stocks dipped, Parliament grew restless, and whispers of abdication circled. To the world, Charles looked weak, but inside Clarence House, he held one secret weapon Camilla didn't know existed: his mother's second, untouched letter. Camilla moved quickly, her survival instincts sharpened by the knowledge that Charles was beginning to see through her mask. She knew she couldn't silence his suspicions, so she turned to the oldest weapon in the royal arsenal: scandal. In a secluded estate in Surrey, shielded by towering gates and guarded by loyalty bought with coin, she convened a circle of powerful men who had long benefited from royal favor. The air in the drawing room was thick with cigar smoke and ambition, as Camilla promised land, contracts, and shares in hidden royal ventures in exchange for their allegiance. It wasn't love or loyalty she sought, it was protection through corruption. Laura was her mother's sharpened blade. With poise that belied her years, she laid out forged emails, doctored photographs, and carefully planted stories, each designed to shred Charles's reputation. They whispered of affairs after his marriage, hinted at secret accounts, and painted him as a monarch incapable of discipline or control. To the nobles and editors present, it was irresistible, a ready-made storm that could be unleashed with a headline. Within hours, the machinery of influence roared to life. The next morning, Britain awoke to front pages dripping with scandal. Headlines screamed of betrayal within the marriage of a king who had allegedly strayed from secret communications meant to destabilize his reign. The tabloids ran with feverish glee, and social media turned the whispers into wildfire. Shares tied to royal estates dipped. Investors backed away in panic, and members of parliament began to mutter behind closed doors about the possibility of abdication if Charles's image collapsed further. The palace, already strained by internal suspicions, seemed on the verge of implosion. Inside Clarence House, Charles was consumed by fury. He slammed reports onto his desk, his voice breaking with disbelief at the scale of deceit. For a man who had spent his life under the microscope of the press, this was a familiar battlefield, but never had the enemy stood so close. The betrayal was intimate, laced with malice that only a wife and stepdaughter could deliver. Alone in his study, he wrestled with despair, asking himself if perhaps he had made a grave mistake in allowing Camilla into the monarchy at all. His heart cracked under the pressure, Yet his spirit refused to collapse. And then, when the fire of scandal threatened to consume him completely, the door to his study opened to an unexpected figure. An elderly former servant, dismissed years before under Camilla's influence, now returned with trembling hands and a fragile envelope. Inside was something Charles never thought he would see again. Queen Elizabeth's untouched will. A second copy, hidden away in secret, preserved by a woman who had served her faithfully until the end. As Charles unfolded it, the words leapt from the page with the same authority his mother had carried in life. It was confirmation that Camilla had been right to fear, and that he now had the proof to bring her reign crashing down. With the Queen's true words in hand, Charles no longer needed whispers or suspicion. He had proof, and a plan that would end his marriage forever. The stage was Clarence House's grand drawing room, but today it wasn't for tea and diplomacy, it was a trap. Charles sat calm, papers spread across the table, while behind velvet curtains, Prince William waited, recorder in hand. Camilla walked in smiling, believing victory was hers, but Charles's first words cut deep. Why would my mother hide her will in a niche only you would know existed? The mask was about to fall. The silence that followed was heavy, as though the walls themselves leaned in to listen. Camilla froze, her practiced grace faltering under the weight of her husband's question. She tried to laugh it off, to dismiss it as idle speculation, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Charles's eyes did not blink, his tone calm but razor-sharp, each word slicing through the web of excuses she had spent months weaving. She felt the ground beneath her shift, realizing this was not the confused man she thought she had manipulated, but a king who had armed himself with undeniable truth. Her mind raced, searching for an escape. Yet in that pressure, the slip came. One sentence, too quick, too careless. Laura only wanted to protect me, she blurted, the name tumbling from her lips before she could stop it. The words hung in the air like a confession signed in blood. Charles leaned back, his face a mixture of sorrow and fury, as William stepped forward from behind the curtain. His presence, silent until that moment, struck Camilla with the force of thunder. In his hand, the recorder glowed red, capturing every syllable of her betrayal. Camilla's composure shattered. She rushed toward Charles, tears spilling freely, her voice breaking as she pleaded. I was afraid, Charles. Afraid of losing you. Of losing everything. It was never meant to be this way. Her sobs filled the room, but Charles did not move to comfort her. For years, he had defended her against critics, protected her against the world's judgment. Now, he saw only a woman who had not just betrayed him, but desecrated his mother's final wish. In silence, Charles reached across the table and laid the Queen's letter before her. The handwriting was familiar, unmistakable and merciless in its clarity. Camilla stared down at the words, her tears staining the very ink that condemned her. No denial could erase what was written. No plea could soften the decree of a sovereign whose authority still lived through the power of her pen. For Camilla, it was the end of the masquerade, the collapse of the careful empire she had built on charm and calculation. The moment was irreversible. William's jaw was set in stone, his eyes burning with the fire of a grandson protecting his grandmother's legacy. Charles's expression was colder still, his heart torn between love and loyalty, yet no longer wavering in choice. For the first time, Camilla realized there was no escape, no trick left to play, no ally to summon. The truth was exposed, laid bare before her husband and the heir to the throne. And in that single confession, Charles knew what had to be done, not as a husband, but as a king defending the crown. The words shook the monarchy like thunder. King Charles filed for divorce. Behind closed palace doors, lawyers drafted the petition, citing betrayal and destruction of the Queen's will. Camilla wept in isolation, abandoned by nobles who once bowed to her. Laura vanished into exile, her name whispered only in disgrace. And Charles, though heartbroken, stood firm choosing the crown, his mother's legacy, over the woman he once believed was his destiny. The decision was not made lightly. Within the guarded chambers of a royal court, known only to the most trusted legal minds, the papers were drawn up in secrecy. It was a filing that would never be announced publicly in full detail, yet its shockwaves reached every corner of the kingdom. To the outside world, rumors swirled of irreconcilable differences, of strain in the royal marriage. But few dared to imagine the truth, that the king himself had accused his queen of destroying the very words of Elizabeth II. As whispers filtered into the press, speculation took hold like wildfire. Headlines debated the future of the monarchy. Tabloids hinted at scandal, and television pundits spoke of cracks in the marriage that had long been visible. Yet, behind the noise, no one truly grasped the depth of betrayal that had forced Charles's hand. The Queen Consort, once celebrated for her resilience, was now a figure of pity. Her name tied to disgrace, she could no longer outrun. The silence from her side was deafening, and in that silence, the world drew its own conclusions. Camilla's isolation was swift and merciless. The nobles who once courted her favor vanished overnight, unwilling to be tainted by association with her downfall. Invitations ceased, doors closed. The very lords and editors she had once counted as allies withdrew into shadows, their loyalty shifting back to the king and his heir. Alone in her chambers, she was left to wrestle with regret. The grandeur of her crown reduced to a memory of what might have been. She had played for survival and lost everything. Laura, too, disappeared. The daughter who had masterminded the destruction of the will fled into obscurity, her reputation beyond repair. Her name, once spoken in the salons of aristocracy, now carried only whispers of treachery. She retreated into exile, her ambitions in ruins, her family ties reduced to shame. No longer the hidden strategist beside her mother, she became a ghost, erased from the stage she had once sought to control. And what of Charles? To the world he appeared resolute, but in private, grief hollowed him. He replayed the history of their love, from whispered letters in years past to stolen moments of laughter when the world scorned them both. He remembered the years of defiance when he defended her against all odds, choosing her despite the weight of judgment. Now, in the quiet of his study, he wondered whether those years had been real, or if they had all been the prelude to betrayal. His heart mourned the woman he thought he knew, but his crown demanded he accept the woman she truly was. As the monarchy staggered through scandal, it began to steady itself under the rising prominence of William and Catherine. Their image, youthful, steadfast, united, became the balm for a kingdom unsettled by betrayal. Where Charles had chosen duty over devotion, William and Catherine offered the people the reassurance of stability and the promise of renewal. The Queen's legacy, though scarred by fire and treachery, seemed preserved in them, as if Elizabeth had foreseen this transfer of trust all along. But even as the legal papers sealed his marriage's end, Charles looked to the Queen's words one last time for strength, for legacy, and for the future of the crown. In the dim light of Clarence House, Charles read his mother's handwriting one final time. Protect the monarchy from Camilla at all costs. Those words, hidden in a wall, had survived fire, betrayal, and deceit. They guided him now as king, as father, and as son. The Queen was gone, but her true will had triumphed. Camilla had fallen. The monarchy stood, and the echoes of betrayal would haunt the crown forever. As Charles traced the letters, he saw not just ink, but the foresight of a sovereign who had spent her life shielding the institution from weakness. The letter had become a symbol, proof that Elizabeth's wisdom reached beyond the grave, surviving where schemes had failed. For William and Catherine, it was more than inheritance. It was a charge, a destiny reaffirmed. Their place as the future of the monarchy was sealed, their path cleared by a grandmother who had prepared them even in silence. Camilla, meanwhile, was remembered not as a queen, but as a betrayer, her name forever tied to fire and deception rather than devotion. The monarchy, though scarred, rose stronger, as if reborn through trial by flame. Yet even as Charles folded the letter away, a question lingered in the shadows of Buckingham's walls. If one secret had survived for so long, what other truths still lay hidden, waiting to emerge? And so, the fire meant to erase the Queen's will instead burned a marriage to ashes, proving once again, the crown survives, but love does not. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you,